Peace be upon you and welcome to Way Stations. My name is Rehan Khan, your co-host for today's show, where we explore the subject of Futuwwa, or sometimes translated as chivalry. I'm joined by my regular co-host, Dr. Walead Mosaad. Dr. Walead, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Rehan. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well. Great. So we're going to be discussing the topic of Futuwwa today, which some would translate as chivalry, or perhaps a good explanation would be when you put the needs of others before yourself. And I think in traditional civilizations, the notion of putting others before yourself was also referred to as maybe gallantry or valor, or being magnanimous and an act of nobility. And in fact, I guess these were the type of virtues or character traits that people would often aspire to. And that's how you'd actually recognize someone, not by the material possessions or by the influence that they had, but by the noble traits of character or virtue, of which Futuwwa or chivalry was one of those. And of course, the modern world has, I think, to a large part, inverted that today. So today, people who are wealthy or who have influence are seen as perhaps higher in the echelons of society as opposed to those who have great character. But anyway, so I've used the term Futuwwa, and I say some might translate that as chivalry. A question just to start off with, Dr. Waleed, would you translate it that way, or can you just explain more about this term and how it's been regarded?
Sure. Futuwwa is kind of an ancient word. You find its origins in the Quran. It comes from the original Arabic word of fata, which means young man or perhaps young virtuous man. It's mentioned twice in the Quran, once in reference to the Prophet Abraham or Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he broke the idols of the people who were worshipping idols in his town. And they asked who could have done this. And they said it's a fata named Ibrahim. That's one instance. And then the other instance, the people of the cave, or the dwellers of the cave. In Surah Al-Kahf, إِنَّهُمْ فِتْيَةٌ آمَنُوا بِرَبِّهِمْ وَزِدْنَاهُمْ هُدًى. So fitya being the plural of fata, they were this group of young virtuous men who believed in their Lord, and we increased them in guidance. But it's not specific in its general meaning now to a gender or to even a young person, but it's meant to be taken as you mentioned, kind of a code of ethics, morality, altruism, putting valor, gallantry, as you said, putting others before yourself. And if you look at the word chivalry in English, it comes from a French word that was kind of the code of ethics of the French knights, the mounted horsemen. And you have a kind of a similar etymology also in Futuwwa. And obviously the link between like a martial tradition and a virtue tradition is important because, in war, in battle, training for battle, lives are at stake. There has to be precision, there has to be preferring, looking at the whole army as one, especially if it's an infantry or a cavalry. Cavalry especially has to act in unison. So I think the idea to instill these character quality traits within an army, the members of an army, was very important in all traditions. You also have maybe we'll talk about it later, the Bushido tradition or the Tao tradition in the Far East. And so very samurai tradition of, that look to instill in addition to this kind of discipline, let's say a physical discipline and moral discipline, but also a spiritual discipline. So that meaning also has been extended from the word Futuwwa. So it kind of means spiritual virtue discipline. So it's not something kind of separate from the understanding of the ethics of Islam, but maybe seen within it as giving a name and maybe a code to how we go about practicing it and implementing it. So, one of the things I think that they realized is a lot of these altruistic character traits are meant to be practiced as in a community, in a group. It's not something that you do on your own. And we'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but the I would have to say the extreme form of individualism that we have today runs very contrary to that. So even when we look at ethics within today's context, it's also most of the time in light of the individual, right? It's like, I need to get a step up, and how can what do they say? How do I hack my health? And it's always looking at self-improvement and self-help. The word self is always there. And it's not really looking at how does that work altogether with the community, except maybe in the contents when it's very, let's say, utilitarian or maybe even Machiavellian. Everybody read the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. So it's put in that light. Whereas in the Futuwwa tradition, it would be more about how do I become a virtuous person, and one that truly is embodied with the ethics of love and service, and love being as a prerequisite to service. I want to serve others because that's the highest form of humanity, and that's the embodiment of the highest form of humanity. And you can't serve others unless you love them, and you can't love them unless you know who you are and who they are, and you have a code and mode of conduct and virtues that you live by, and not just what you feel like spur of the moment based upon what your needs are, but looking to others' needs first before your own. And so that's what I think made a virtuous society. So the Futuwwa came out in this. So it's not specific to gender, it's not specific to age. Everyone can be a feta, so to speak, or can have like this chivalrous knightly kind of behavior about them, and need not be an expert horseman or archer, but they can embody the virtues and moral code that a lot of these people had in the past, that kind of informed even their martial tradition, and not just their character and so forth.
Yeah, and I think one thing you mentioned there was various other traditions around the world. The Futuwwa being associated more with the Muslim world, and one of those you mentioned was the Bushido, the kind of the tradition of the samurai in Japan. And I guess I think the translation of Bushido is the way of the warrior, I believe. And for the samurai, their sword was almost like an extension. It wasn't just a tool; it was an extension of their soul. It was like who they were. And so combat was seen in many ways as also as a kind of a spiritual test of internal discipline and external skills. So you had to have the internal discipline to wield a weapon, which was then done externally. And I guess one thing that, and you mentioned the French tradition as well, I think in the West, often the notion of chivalry was also linked quite closely to like courtly love. And also it was linked to, often protecting the fair maiden or something. It was very much tied into that kind of storytelling. Whereas in the Bushido tradition, that definitely wasn't the case. It was more about, having the right kind of conduct and being unwavering in terms of your the principles and your virtues. And if I remember rightly, the samurai had like 7 virtues as part of the Bushido. I don't remember them all, but a few of them were like, I think, benevolence. You have the power to kill someone, but you also have the power to help someone. Another one's like respect. So, a true warrior is very courteous towards their enemies, and to the animals and to the landscape and so on. And then, of course, honor. And honor was a really, really huge thing as well for the samurai. And I think there are 4 others as well. So these virtues were part of the Bushido. And I guess within the Futuwwa tradition, there were kind of similar things. And if I look at it broadly, I suppose in the Bushido, the ideal tradition of the samurai is the one who serves, right? And in the Futuwwa tradition, it's also the one who serves and the one who loves. And the core essence of the core source of the Bushido is like Zen Buddhism, Shinto, traditions like that. And within the Futuwwa tradition, like I guess it's kind of Islamic, tradition as well. So they all go back to rooted traditions, which I think is important because when you are rooted, then you're much stronger than just being unrooted, and you're rooted in something, you're rooted in a tradition. And of course, maybe I can just bring you in on this as well, which is that in the pre-Islamic tradition, there was also this notion of Futuwwa, or the warrior poet, in Arabian poetry. And of course, individuals like Antara ibn Shaddad, perhaps being one of the most famous, and there were many others, but perhaps being one of the most famous ones. And his poems are still read today, even comic books named after Antara today that you can read. But there was that real sense of that code of honor as well. So to what extent was that earlier Futuwwa tradition that was already there in Arab society, then kind of also then we see the same things showing up later on, or was it very different?
I think there's some similarities, but you have to know that prior to Islam, that whole tradition of warring tribes and wars that went on for decades over the silliest of things. One of the stories was that someone rode his bride's camel. No one was to ride the bride's camel after the bride, but if someone did that, then that would be a cause for war and conflict and so forth. So they had, we refer to it as jahiliyyah because they acted more upon, emotion and this kind of sense of pride. But I think also, some of the attitudes were not without merit. And that certainly came into Islam after that. People who were warriors before were warriors after. So, the most famous two examples probably were the younger uncle of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Hamza, often referred to as the lion, and Umar ibn al-Khattab. And it was actually after those two became Muslim within days of each other. And it said that the nascent Muslim community really couldn't enter into the sacred precinct of the Kaaba before that, because they would be abused and harmed by the Quraysh. But after that, they formed two lines, one line behind Umar, one line behind Hamza, and no one did anything to them. So they had this, and they were barely, they just became Muslim. They were freshly minted, Muslims. So, but they had this, let's call it Futuwwa, or this, kind of protector, guardian aspect to them. Also mentioned in this regard, Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ and son-in-law, also was seen as someone who had this warrior ethos at the same time, courageous, willing to do anything for the service of the Ummah, for the service of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And there are many other companions who were like that too, but these three in particular are often mentioned kind of in that vein. And this carried over afterwards, and people continue to kind of associate courage and honor and valor as things that are part and parcel of the tradition. And obviously, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, or the two grandsons actually, both of them are part of that tradition also. So al-Hasan and al-Husayn. Al-Hasan, his most virtuous act that he did was he reneged his claim to the Khilafah in order to avoid bloodshed between two groups of Muslims. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had foretold of this during his lifetime, that he would be the reason for avoiding of calamity and bloodshed between two groups of Muslims. And then Sayyidina Hussein was also very virtuous and brave, and he went out to Karbala and he went out to Iraq, seeking justice and seeking to reunite the Muslims. And then obviously he stood in battle by himself and fought valiantly until he fell as well. So that kind of thing was also always associated with them. But it wasn't, as I said before, it wasn't specific to men, also women. Many of the women participated in battle, not just as nurses, but even took up the sword and were participants in the battle. And so not just, but also in the martial tradition, as we said, but this idea of embodiment of these virtues and putting others before oneself. And I think in general, we mentioned the period before Islam. I think even when there was not a kind of let's say, a monotheistic trend or kind of ethos in society, but there was still an idea of community and sacrifice and something bigger than yourself and serving others, and though it may have been skewed at times and mixed with a little bit of this jahiliyyah, but there was something was there still. In contrast to, I think, what happened later, the later developments and this kind of very naked and blind and blatant individualism that has all but supplanted this idea of community and caring for one another and serving one another and that sort of thing. And we've kind of been reduced to this zero-sum game. There's only so much to go around, and if I don't get my piece of the pie, then that's something I'm forfeiting, and someone else will get it, and so forth. And this altruism, I think, you found even we've talked about this before, in how they sold things in economics, and how vendors in a market would all be situated in the same place. And even those, the whatever particular trade that they did, they would be seen as kind of Futuwwa club or a guild. And this was even in Ottoman times, in the Mamluk times, that they formed these guilds, and usually they would have like a sheikh or a teacher that they all kind of share together. They would share other things. They would share meals. They would share customers. If they've sold enough for the day, then they point out the potential customer to another vendor who's, so it was a brotherhood, and brotherhood in the meaning of not just a colleague at work, but someone that you'd be willing to sacrifice for. So, these things were, I think, very much part of these societies, and I think that's what people are missing today. And when they look at how people live in these more communal societies, especially Westerners who are used to individualism, I think they find it very attractive, and they're interested in finding more about it.
Yeah. So, you mentioned, we mentioned then there's, within the Quran, there were some stories, about Prophet Abraham and also the young men of the cave. And then you've mentioned the tradition around the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and many of his companions. And you kind of hinted that later some of this tradition of Futuwwa also continued. Could you maybe just kind of explore that a little bit more, especially around the kind of akhlaq tradition, or some of the other people who came at the time of the Ayyubids, for instance, some of the teachers then, and how they kind of developed that Futuwwa tradition, and what the impact of it was?
It continued, and in let's say, in terms of what people wrote about, there was kind of two threads, so to speak. There was something called kind of the akhlaq genre, which was more based upon the virtue ethics that was found in the Hellenistic tradition, so Aristotle, Plato, so forth. Ghazali uses that to some degree in the Ihya. So the idea that there are 4 cardinal virtues, and they all amount to wisdom, and they include temperance and perseverance and so forth. That came from the Hellenistic tradition and was kind of Islamicized by the likes of Ghazali, but even before Ghazali, the Neoplatonic philosopher tradition in Islam also did that, like the Farabis and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and so forth. So they did talk about it in those tones. And then I think more expansively and later on, it was taken up by the discipline of Tasawwuf or Sufism. Probably the most famous book that was written about Futuwwa was by Abu Abd al-Sulami. And that was within the first 4 centuries, 4th century or 5th century. He lived a little bit time before Al-Ghazali. And his book called Kitab al-Futuwwa, simply stated, Kitab al-Futuwwa. So he has about 50 plus kind of articles of Futuwwa in it, and amongst them it'd be like to prefer your brother over yourself, to visit them without invitation, to see that your wealth is free, is they have more right to it than you do, so forth. To preserve old friendships, to not seek and look after and try to find out the faults of your friends, but rather overlook them. To not remind people of the favors that you've done for them. Just do the favors, and there's no reason to keep reminding them, I've done this, that, and this other thing for you. So a lot of it has to do with kind of putting the ego at rest, which you find in the Tasawwuf tradition, obviously. But then I think what Futuwwa has that's distinctive, it brings it out in, what does everyday interaction look like, and what do relationships look like, and what are they based upon, from a practical perspective. So from that regard, I think it's quite important. And people don't realize it, but I would, there's some studies that show, and if you look at the historical record, that a lot of the revival in the Muslim community, every century or so, there's kind of a revival based upon the revival hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, or tajdeed. And a lot of that has to do with the revival in character and ethics and interactions with one another. One of the primal figures in that regard is Abdul Qadir Jilani, who lived in the 6th century of Hijrah in Baghdad. And you can kind of have an intellectual genealogical trace from him to the lieutenants of Nuruddin Zenki, who then later became formed the army of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, or Saladin in Western vernacular. So he was largely responsible for the liberation of Palestine from the Crusaders and uniting the two most powerful Muslim entities at the time, Egypt and Syria. And they were students of Abdul Qadir Jilani. And Abdul Qadir Jilani, stayed in Baghdad, and he taught for 40 to 50 years. And he had regular sessions, and he talked much about akhlaq, and he talked about futuwwa, and he talked about virtues, and he talked about returning back to Allah. And if you read his discourses, there's a little bit of a sharpness to them sometimes. So he was kind of, you get the feeling is like, you people got to get your act together, because it's high time, and we have the Crusaders threatening from the north, and we have the Mongols threatening from the east, and if we don't really get our act together, then there's not going to be much of us left. And that was the tumult of the times that he lived in. And from there came what was, likely the most important or last most important revival to happen in the Muslim world. And a lot of what we study now, a lot of how societies, even in the modern Muslim world, are formed, are due to what happened during those very pivotal 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries of the Hijrah. So, like 11, 12, 13 centuries, Gregorian calendar were very important, very vital. And a lot of that was based in this kind of valor, gallantry, virtue ethics, Futuwwa. This is the period where many of the zawaya, or the Sufi lodges, began to form and be built. And they were basically places to go so you can become a feta, you can become a real person, you can become a human being in the full sense of the word. People visit in Konya the complex of Jalaluddin Rumi, and in the West he's known as this incredible poet and poet of love and so forth. But actually he was a practitioner of Futuwwa, and he had that lodge there in Konya. And he trained people. He was a proper sheikh and tarbiyah and cultivator of souls. In addition, obviously, to the Methnawi that everybody knows about, but he produced people, and he had an endowment that still stands till today. So the waqf that he established is still feeding people 800-900 years later from the time he established it. So these are all kind of when we talk about legacy, and these are the embodiments of, I think, what is the best of people, and a lot of that comes from the altruistic vein and current within our understanding of Futuwwa.
Yeah, I know that's very interesting, and I think one thing that you kind of hinted at there also is that the people who really practice this kind of Futuwwa or chivalry, even their enemies have high regard for them, because they know where they stand with them. And I think one figure from history who you did mention there was Salahuddin, or in the West as he's known as Saladin. And if you look at how Saladin the historical figure was seen after he took back Jerusalem from the Crusaders. Well, initially the reaction was from in the Christian world in the West was that, well, he was sent as a stick by God to punish the Christians because we had fallen into sin. That was the general view. And quite quickly afterwards, the kingdoms of England and France, they actually introduced a Saladin tithe, like a tax at 10%. So there's a 10% levy on revenues. So you're going to become really unpopular if you have a tax named after you. So there was a Saladin tax, right? And so it was, it was because he was such an unpopular figure. But then gradually, all these stories start to emerge about Saladin in the West. And the stories start coming through that this is a man of great generosity, he's a man of great integrity, of faith and culture. And then if you look at the historical writing, it just starts to change. I mean, the first real kind of positive retelling of Saladin in the West is actually in Germany, a German court poet in about the year 1208. He's criticizing his master, who was Philip of Swabia, who was the king of Germany, for not distributing money during good times. So during times of affluence, the king of Germany wasn't distributing money. And so the court poet was saying, look, Saladin distributed money during good times and bad times. So that's kind of one of the early examples of Saladin being used in the West to essentially critique their own leaders. From the 13th century, you also start seeing stories being circulated. One of the most famous ones in France was was a story called "The Daughter of the Count of Ponthieu," and this was an interesting story because now it was a story about the origin of Saladin. And the story claimed, and it became very popular, that Saladin was actually descended from the Count of Ponthieu, and he was French. So this, because you have to understand the French kind of thinking at the time was that, well, this man was chivalric. He was really like an ideal knight. So he can only be French because only the French are ideal, right? So it can't be anyone else. So they create this whole. They claim him. There's a whole story where they claim that Saladin is French, and they also claim that on his deathbed, he does a auto baptism. He baptizes himself, and before he dies, and all the rest of it. So all this kind of story is going around in France, in Germany, in England, and of course, this carries through in many other historical examples. Throughout all the way through to the 16th century onwards, there were, if you look at the censuses of the period, you'll find that there were individuals in the West who were called Saladin. So there's a case in 1241 in the UK where there was a man called Saladin of Garsington, and he lived just southeast of Oxford, and he was a surety in a land case, interestingly enough. In Genoa, in the Italian city, there were people there who were called Saladinus, okay? And some of them came from very notable families. So you actually had people then at that period in the West who were naming their children after Saladin. Right, which is very interesting in itself. Yeah. And of course, then later, during the time of sort of Arab nationalism, and you have characters like Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, obviously invoking Saladin. Famously, Gamal Abdel Nasser invokes Saladin. And famously, I think it was when President Mubarak came to London in 1985 and met with the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Upon greeting the Egyptian premier, she said, and I quote, Margaret Thatcher said to President Mubarak, "Relations between Britain and Egypt are excellent. Of course, they go back quite a long time. We were already on good terms in the days of Saladin and Richard the Lionheart." So he's kind of like been used throughout history, I think, as this exemplar, as this knight, even by people who would, I guess, be considered his enemies, but they've been invoking him. So I guess he's someone who has that chivalric, who has lived that chivalric pursuit. But anyway, history lesson aside, maybe I could just move the conversation a little bit to talking about this kind of moving from Futuwwa, but also linking it to the kind of the modern masculine sense of self and how that shows up today. And maybe you could just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. I think all versions of masculinity in some way or form want to connect to the idea of bravery, valor, courage, some sort of self-sacrifice, and even in the popular culture, the popular movies like Braveheart. Mel Gibson is basically disemboweled at the end, and William Wallace, and he fought for Scottish freedom, and Gladiator also, though fictional, but kind of a similar thing during the Roman Empire. But I think the problem is where they get it wrong is that they, at least the modern version of what we're seeing lately, is there's a lot of this kind of false bravado and the idea that somehow masculinity means this sort of hyper form of masculinity that doesn't have any softness to it, or let's say mercy and compassion, because that then would be seen as a form of weakness. A political leader recently said, we will show them no quarter. Whether he realized what his words mean or not, but when you say you show them no quarter, it means you're not going to take any prisoners. You'll kill everybody on sight, which would be against the Geneva Conventions and all that. But whether they meant it as a form of rhetoric or so that kind of speech and talk, though, may not be indicative of reality, but that's the assumption. Okay, that's what it looks like to be masculine. And you just mentioned Saladin, and what was, in addition to his military exploits, I think his enemies at least respected him because of what he didn't do. His exploits off of the battlefield, and his compassion and mercy, and he didn't. He gave people quarter, and he gave people a chance to, and he sacked and laid siege to Jerusalem, but he allowed all of the inhabitants to leave, and safe passage. Unlike the Crusaders, who, when they went there 80 years earlier, they killed everybody, and the streets were flooded with blood up to the knees, and they bragged about it. So quite a distinction between, I think, those two forms. And so there is this, I think, very ugly, and use the modern word, toxic form of it's not really masculinity. It's from an Islamic perspective, we would say it's jahiliyyah, that masquerades as kind of a true masculinity. But I think a true masculinity has what we would call a combination of both what we consider to be masculine and feminine traits. Other words that are used in Arabic language indicated something called al-muru'ah. And muru'ah comes from the word mar, which means man, or imra'ah, which means woman. So they actually have the same root. And it just means your gender is, yes, there's a distinction about it, but there are common traits and attributes to both genders, and each one will have some level of both masculine and feminine. So if with the masculine aspect, maybe the idea of protection, guardianship, bravery, courage, more associated with the masculine side. But then from the feminine side, we have care, compassion, mercy. The word mercy in Arabic is feminine. Even there is a hadith that indicates that the womb, which is called the rahim in Arabic, which is the same root word as rahma, mercy, was taken from the rahma, from the mercy of God. And then that was infused into the womb, because it's a merciful place. For 9 months, all of your needs are taken care of. It's the most merciful place you can be. And then the idea of embodying divine traits. Well, God doesn't have a gender, according to our theology. We refer to him as a he because he refers to himself as a he, but that doesn't mean he's a he in the sense that he's a man, right, or masculine. We just use the masculine pronoun. But otherwise, the traits that we see within the divine are traits that, and especially the what we'd say the jamali traits, which probably are much closer to the feminine traits, are the ones that can be embodied in a human being. And then the jalali traits, or the traits or attributes of magnificence, are less likely to be, or not at all able to be, embodied within a human being. So, an example of a feminine or jamali trait would be mercy, compassion, lutf, or latif. And then the masculine, or more, let's call them jalali traits, would be like al-mutakabbir, al-muntaqim, the avenger, right, is one of the names of God. And in the hadith that is spoken by God himself, he said, awesomeness, al-azama, wal-kibriya, and being most high and powerful, which belong solely to God. He said, anyone who challenges me in them, then I will destroy them. So when we take those traits on for ourselves, whether it be a man or a woman, then you become tyrannical, then you become corrupt, then you become a megalomaniac or a tyrant that cannot be tolerated and causes damage and harm to the world. So it always has to be, this sort of masculine side tempered with these jamani, more feminine traits, and both men and women can have their share of that. And when the Arab Bedouin came to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and he was asked how many children he had, and he said he had 12, and he said, I never kissed any of them. And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, where's your mercy? Where's your compassion? So he had falsely thought, this Arab Bedouin, that's masculinity. Show no emotion, be tough all the time, spare them no quarter, and so forth. No, it's actually not quite like that. And the more powerful thing, when the Prophet ﷺ asked his companions, who is the most powerful amongst us? Who's the strongest? And they said, the one who can wrestle the other to the ground and pin him, which would probably be a typical answer here today. He said, no, that's not it. He said, the one who can control themselves or himself when they get angry, to not let their anger consume them. Right? And then if you don't let your anger consume you, then when you're doing things and you're making decisions and you're cognizant of how you're affecting others, that's a real act of strength. It's quite easy to let your emotions run rampant and just do whatever you feel in the moment. That's not masculinity. That's not futuwwa. That's not muru'ah. That's not chivalry. None of those things that modern masculinity seems to have forgotten, and instead feels that manipulation and getting your way. And now I've seen in a popular culture the idea of the anti-hero, being the one that people want to follow, and they break the rules. They don't listen to anybody. They'll just break bones and kill people, and then these are the people that are celebrated in the popular culture, in the movies and in film and so forth. So I think it's a real problem, and unfortunately for our youth, if this is the example that's being waved in front of them, and they don't see something that's positive, it could be really disastrous.
Yeah, no. So I think you said there's quite a lot you covered there. I think if I can maybe just pull one of the strands, because there was so much that you said, which is around the popular culture and storytelling, because I think when you look at stories, how this notion of masculine, feminine is played out with characters, you have stories where sometimes you have a balanced hero. Now, when I mean balanced hero, the hero has these strong masculine attributes, but they also have some feminine attributes, either compassionate, yeah, and they can show that compassion, the kindness to others. So you have a story where you have a balanced hero and you have a passive heroine. Now, in these stories, the heroine is portrayed as someone who's very soft, very yielding, very loving, very feminine. And because they're like that, they fall under the power of a dark figure. But if that passive heroine had just been a bit more connected with some masculine attributes, i.e., just because if she'd been a little bit tougher, she probably wouldn't have fallen into the hands of a dark figure. And so you've got
damsel in distress.
Damsel in distress. That's right. So you have stories like that where you have a balanced hero and then you have a passive heroine. Then you have stories which might be you have a balanced hero, once more, someone who's has a strong masculine attributes, but also has the feminine attributes of kindness and mercy. And you have an active heroine. So in these stories, the heroine has all the feminine attributes, but they also have that toughness as well. And so, famous stories might be something like when Theseus faces the Minotaur in the labyrinth, and then Ariadne comes to his help. Or you have the Lord of the Rings. You have stories like Aragon, and then you have the Elf Princess, and you have Galadriel. And so there you've got characters who are balanced, and then the heroine is also balanced, and so then together they can do more. Then you have stories where maybe you have the balanced heroine and the dark hero. So in this one, the heroine is actually someone who is truly balanced. They're in touch with their feminine side, their masculine side, but the hero has fallen into darkness, i.e., they're just connected to their dark masculine energy. All right, and because of that, they're just going, they're going in the wrong direction. And we see a lot of that today. We see a lot of that. People who are just connected to dark, masculine energy, but they're not connected to their feminine energy. And then, of course, then you have sometimes, but it's very rare, you do have some stories where you have a dark heroine and you have a light hero. So now in this one, the heroine has become hard, has become self-centered, has become domineering. A story like The Secret Garden, where the character Mary is very much like that. She's very spoilt, very bratish. But then when she meets the light hero, then the light hero starts to invoke that feminine side within her and she becomes balanced again. So storytelling, I think, in a classical way, is always about taking characters away from darkness into light, rebalancing them. And great stories do that. They rebalance because they show that's the only way. You need to be connected. If you're a man, you need to be connected to your masculine and feminine attributes. If you're a female, you need to be connected to your masculine and feminine attributes as well. And I think great stories do that. Whereas today, there's a real muddle around that, a real misunderstanding about what is masculine. It's just being brutish, it's being aggressive. And in many ways, that I guess is a reaction also to how society has developed. But that, perhaps is a slightly different subject. One last thing I kind of wanted to just maybe ask you about, Dr. Waleed, which is if there are people who are interested in pursuing this tradition of Futuwwa, what do you suggest they should do? How should they, bring this into their life? What are the things they could do?
Yeah, that's a great question. But you said something just now that made me think. We didn't really touch upon the topic of femininity, and I think Futuwwa applies to that equally as well. And I think even within Muslim culture, some people are under the impression that we subscribe to this idea of the damsel in distress, and women are just like porcelain dolls that need to be, hidden somewhere and protected. And not at all. I mean, they too have to have their share, like you said, of both the feminine and the masculine. And and there's many stories of women who were like that. Asma bint Abi Bakr, who carried the food back and forth to her father and the Prophet ﷺ, or in the cave with much danger to herself, and avoiding spies following her and making sure she covered her tracks and this sort of thing. And so, and Safiya, the aunt of the Prophet ﷺ, who participated in one of the battles and actually had to fight a man, and she felled him in battle. These are things people may not be necessarily aware of, but that tradition exists there. And I think, from a Muslim culture perspective, we don't have this idea that maybe in some manifestations of culture that had a pre-existing view of women in this way, but women, they are very much equal partners in society, and very much equal in terms of their ability to participate in the Futuwwa tradition. And something we've talked about that I'm interested in, Furusiya, maybe we can talk about that later, but horseback riding, and it's the one sport actually where men and women participate completely equally. There's no like men's division and women's division, and because it's basically the same. There's no advantage. It's not about a physical advantage in that, in terms of size and muscles and strength, but it's more about your ability to control yourself and control your mount, the horse, and that's equal access to both men and women. So and I think we have versions of femininity out there that are actually also toxic, just in the same way, that where women are objectified and made just to be at the mercy of men, in not just in a sexual way, but in many different ways. And I think that's also quite unhealthy. And incidentally, I think this is what I've seen in it's led to a lot of breakdown in relationships between men and women, like marital relationships or intimate relationships, because they don't know how to interact. They're not sure how does my masculinity fit with her femininity, and how do we manage that together, and how do we make it complementary and make it a partnership, and so forth. So it's almost like the yin and the yang. Yeah, they're supposed to interact in that way, in the best way. So, but as for your question about, well, what do we do now? I think, which has been kind of the answer to many of the things we've talked about, but you need to be in company of people who practice this, people who embody these virtues. You can read many books about it, but it's going to remain theoretical until you actually are, embedded within a community. And let's call them Futuwwa communities. They're just like we talk about generational wealth today in terms of passing, an estate from one to the next. There was generational wealth in terms of character and virtues that was passed from one to the next, and that sort of thing can't be created overnight. It takes dedication from individuals, and they build it within their families, and then it spreads out to the community to the degree that it becomes embedded within the very fiber of people's persona and their character, and then they pass it on to their children, who in turn pass the people around them, and so forth. So I don't think it's an easy solution by any means, and I don't have some sort of online forum people can be a part of, but I think we have to think in terms of let's reform these actual communities that are human, and people actually live in proximity, and they have the opportunity to see one another, interact with one another, grow food together, eat together, this sort of thing. And I know you're interested in that, and then we've talked about this on several occasions, but I really think that's long term, that's what's going to have to happen.
Yeah, I think so. And just building on what you said there, I think I remember when I was young, I used to do scouts. So we did scouts, cubs, and then scouts for many, many years. And one of the things I always liked about it was that the fact that you did it in a group. Like you went out together, whether it was learning survival skills, spending a week away, living in a tent, doing orienteering, doing some kind of hunting, learning some basic tools and things like that. It was done in a group, and there was that kind of camaraderie that you developed, almost like a chivalric code that you with other people. And that was actually, I think societies, even in the West, were a bit more communal at the time, whereas now things are quite individualistic. So I think that there's definitely that kind of challenge there. Things are much more individualistic, and there's almost like an abandonment of spiritual frameworks. And it's about very much, well, I feel like this, and I'm going to do it like this and that. So I think that definitely has become a real problem. And even until the 90s, I remember you'd go on the London Underground, and you'd always give up your chair for a lady. You'd never sit down. I just wouldn't do that. I just feel, please, madam, please sit down. And now I'm probably at the age where they'll say to me, no, uncle, you can sit down instead, right? But back then, I mean, it was just normal. Of course, you'd get up. You couldn't be sitting down on the subway where if there's a lady standing. It's just not the right thing to do.
Well, nowadays in the New York City subway, you have something called man spreading, where you actually a man will sit spreading his legs and take two seats.
Really? Okay.
So that's the antithesis of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. So that's what I grew up with. That's even when I was working in the 90s, you just wouldn't do that. And then if someone needed their groceries carried, you'd carry the groceries to wherever you needed to go. You wouldn't raise your voice when there are elders in the room, or there are other people you just wouldn't raise your voice. It's just not the done thing. So I think a lot of that character definitely has been lost, and much of that is down to a disconnection from a bigger kind of spiritual tradition, I suppose, and a lot more individualism as well, which has come in. Okay, I think we're kind of at about a close to the program now, Dr. Waleed. But just before we go, maybe we can both put in a book recommendation. Do you have a book recommendation for this week that you'd like to give?
I actually have 3. So if
my gosh,
if you're interested,
of course, I'm sure the listeners are very interested.
If you're interested in Futuwwa, from maybe the book I was talking about earlier is in translation with a different title. It's called Sufi Chivalry, but it is the book of Futuwwa of Imam al-Sulami. And I think it was translated by a Turkish scholar. I can't recall his name right now, but you can find that on the internet. And then 2 other books written about Futuwwa with 2 personal friends of mine, actually. One of them written by Dr. Recep Senturk, a Turkish theologian and scholar, and his book is called Futuwwa, Noble Character. He's also the head of Usul Academy. That's like a hybrid program for Islamic studies. And a friend of mine from the States, Imam Dawud Walid, also wrote a book called Futuwwa that I know has been used in circles in the United States for young men, and they practice it. And I know some some groups in the UK also, the community at Mustafa Mount of Sheikh Ibrahim Osi Afa make use of that book, and they actually have like Futuwwa programs that they conduct every summer for young men to come together, and they learn some of the martial arts, but then they try to have this kind of group community thing that they do for a couple of weeks, and I think those are really, really excellent initiatives that inshallah will lead to something even greater and bigger. So those would be my recommendations.
Yeah, no, great. And I think maybe we can at least get one or two of those gentlemen on the program as well at some point in the future. That'd be fantastic. So I think from my side, I would recommend a historical book called The Life and Legend of Sultan Saladin by Jonathan Phillips. Jonathan's actually a friend of mine, and he's a professor in the UK. And The Life and Legend of Sultan Saladin is basically, it's a book which really explores and unpacks the whole economic, political, and social dimension of what was happening around the whole counter-crusade, and in a bid to get Jerusalem back, all the trials and tribulations Nuruddin Zengi had to go through, and then later Salahuddin or Saladin had to go through, and how they had to really get everyone on their side, which was very, very difficult, because you'd have thought that they would have, all the people around the area, the Muslims and others would have thought, well, we need to get rid of these crusaders, let's unite and let's get rid of them. It wasn't that simple. People were just so divided, and they weren't interested, and they were just interested in protecting their own little patch. And he goes into great detail. And one of the things I found most fascinating was that when Salahuddin, quite accidentally, when he became ruler of Egypt, because obviously he went there with his uncle, I think it was Shirkuh, I think was his uncle. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he went there with his uncle. His uncle passed away unexpectedly, and he becomes the Sultan. Then one of the things that he does is he commissions a study to look at the optimal time for harvesting and seed planting around Egypt. And over the next several years, he really optimized the treasury and how much money it could raise in Egypt, because they needed cash. You can't do a counter crusade if you have no money. And so what Dr. Phillips does, he says, talking about Salahuddin, the warrior, sounds really heroic, but Salahuddin, the accountant, doesn't sound very good. But actually, he was a great accountant, and he understood finance really, really well. So he really got his financial strategy built first, and he got Egypt as a breadbasket, generating cash, which then allowed him to then become Salahuddin the warrior. And so there are things like that in the book which you come across, and which is quite delightful, really. But it is also the reality, right? How can you fight a war if you have no money? So
Yeah,
I thought that's quite an interesting one. All right, great. So thank you, Dr. Waleed, once more, and always a pleasure to talk to you. And we thank our listeners for listening. And if you do have a chance to give the show a rating, please do. And if you have a chance to maybe let a couple of friends know, then please also pass on the message. Thank you, and peace be upon you from us. All the best.